Well, today's episode, for better or for worse, was designed by my co-host Mike. And as soon as I saw it wasn't about tax legislation, I knew everything would be okay. Today's
Rude.
topic is all about housing innovation and putting forth our ideas on changes that could be implemented to ease affordability and foster a healthy property market here in Australia.
Our view of a healthy property market is a consistent rental market with a stable and reasonable vacancy rate or spare capacity, e.g. about 3%, which we've sort of seen as the average historical vacancy rate. The ability for first home buyers to be able to participate with it without a six-figure salary, having to wait for a life partner or needing the bank of mum and dad chipping in like the clappers, and for people to be able to move between houses with minimal impediments so they're in a home that better suits their need or is fit for purpose. And finally, the necessary supply of government housing available so those living below or around the poverty line have access to low-cost housing and not forced to live on the streets.
Yeah, great points, Dave. I've put in a couple of extras here, just thinking, as a measure of market health, auction clearance rates in auction cities are also a good indicator. Not always reliable in non-auction cities, but, balanced market tends to be around that 60 to 65. An aggressive market, as we know, is above 80. And a buyer's market is sub 60, and a falling market usually sort of kicks in when you're under 55. So obviously market health is measured by all kinds of metrics, but this is a good indicator. And I think it's important to talk about investor participation too, because we know that investors have previously nudged first home buyers out of the way. And when their purchasing starts to exceed a third of all purchases, that's usually when we start to hear the jungle drums. Sorry, Dave.
I was just going to say that's a good point. I mean, when it got up to 45% of investors was when APRA stepped in with making some of those changes around lending restrictions for investors, which arguably have gone on for too long and causing some of the issues we're in now. But keeping around a third is a good balance too, isn't it, for a healthy market?
Indeed. And what made this of interest to you, Mike?
Well, before you get too excited, I am going to weave tax legislation into this discussion that has been accepted as a challenge. But really, I kind of think there's a lot of voices in the property market, and I don't think we have a shortage of commentators. They seem to come from all sorts of different directions, and you see new names every day in the media. It's very easy to sort of look at something someone's done and go, oh, that doesn't work, or that's terrible, or that's garbage. But it takes a little bit more courage to stand behind your own notions and convictions and say, you know what, that is garbage. Here's what I would do differently. I think there is a little bit of a shortage of that, and I think it comes from the fact that a lot of these commentators are just in the space for the column inches, or it drives their business interests or their profile or ego, heaven forbid. I'm guilty of perhaps a little bit from column A, B, and C and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, I do actually care about the property market and that proper functioning. And a bit like you said, like markets will be hot and markets will be cold. I'm not trying to sort of, flatline it so that doesn't happen, but just a little bit more of a free functioning market, because there are some things that happen in the property market that distort people's behaviours, or there might be a better decision for them within housing, but because of taxes or other imposts, they're not doing it. And the article really was inspired by one of our industry friends, Simon Presley, who actually wrote an article about innovation in the property market. He called it not innovation rather than gumboots on pelicans, which I think is a hilarious image to think of. Yeah. So, he's been a very vocal critic of property markets, but he's quite happy to put out there, well, these are the things that I think would make a difference. So I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to look at some of the things that he's suggested and kind of test them out as a trio on merit, and also, which might be episode 2 of this series, to talk about what we actually think could move the needle. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot anyway since the Pippa breakfast in Melbourne, where the shadow housing minister was in attendance, and he invited me to come to Parliament and provide a similar presentation to what I did. But he also said, and tell me what you would do to fix it. I'm like, oh gosh, I better do some homework. So, I'm killing two birds.
I love
Good
it.
planning, Mike.
Yeah. I always like to
Getting us to
multi-purpose
contribute.
things,
Yeah. So we're contributing to your presentation to the Shadow Minister.
Yeah, and anything that I think is dodgy, I'll leave on the cutting room floor. Any ripping genius gear is going to have Mike Mortlock written beside it.
100%. Well, that's how life works, isn't it? We distill everyone else's knowledge and insights, and
I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, such as the Google Scholar motto.
You could just carry in the YouTube link and a bottle of Shiraz and have an interesting afternoon sitting back watching this episode with Richard, dare I say.
Yes.
But yeah, look, I think this is a great topic, Mike. I'm glad you selected this topic. It's something I've been thinking a lot about and reading a lot about as well. And doing this episode and the episode that will follow, will force me to distill my thoughts as well, because like you say, I mean, you read all these articles and lots of them are just talking about the problems. I'm finding there are more that are starting to suggest solutions, but unless you take the time to really document them for yourselves, think through them, and then work out, okay, well, what do you think would work? You're sort of, you're not any better than anyone else, really, are you? So this is forcing us to put ourselves on the line as well and come up with what we think would make a difference. So, and it's really tricky because it's such a thorny issue. There are many different perspectives and so many different stakeholders, as we know, in the property market. And that's what makes this so hard. You've got developers, you've got renters, first-time buyers, property investors, baby boomers / retirees. We've got the NIMBYs. We've got build-to-rent investment funds. We've got local councils, state governments, federal governments, the various political parties, industry super, ATO via property-related tax income, and then perhaps all that's left is your average mum and dad. That doesn't.
Dave, it does sound like you've thought about it.
So, and that's why it's so complex, because everyone's coming at it from different perspectives and with different needs and wants, and that is a big part of why we have so much red tape and we're mired in inaction.
Yeah, well, all right, let's dive in. I can see that this will be a two-parter, and that's okay. Simon did say in his article that the three biggest barriers for acquiring the Aussie dream of home ownership are loan repayment affordability, government fees, aka stamp duty, and we've got land tax peppered in there as well, and raising a big enough deposit to meet regulatory requirements. Before we leap into his and our suggestions, Dave, would you agree that these three are the big three?
Look, I think honestly, I think it oversimplifies things. I'm just not convinced that when we have a major problem in life, the planet's neatly aligned. That allows us to summarize it into three items like this, like so often happens in articles. And I get why people do that. It makes it easier to follow and read. But you know what? It's a really good three to start with. So, and it does cover a lot of the problems. There's no doubt about that. I think, if we dig into it, there are tens of issues, to be honest. And, sure, some problems or obstacles are larger than others. Personally, I think the biggest issue confronting our property market and the health in terms of how we've defined it, I believe, is the supply of enough new property.
Interesting. I've thought about this question myself as well, and I agree with you. There's multiple, but I think the other bigger barriers that we haven't touched on, maybe not as broadly restrictive as the top three that Simon suggested, and of course lack of supply, but I think credit availability is a big one. I mean, have a look at what happened during 2016 to 2019. That had a very significant effect on available rental stock, and I'd say that was probably the biggest one. We can disincentivize investors all we like, but if no one can buy housing, well, then there's your issue. And we've got a casualised workforce, including gig economy workers now. And we also have new arrivals who might aspire to buy but have visa issues to tackle. So lending and credit is a real issue. We can see in the numbers that credit availability is better now, but there's a cohort of buyers out there that could afford to buy a property who don't fit regular bank parameters.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. And I think I'm actually really looking forward to a more dedicated space to chew on those ideas, and I'm actually still mid the process myself in what I think is really important. But we know for a fact that credit availability has a direct correlation to what's happening in the market, right? Because you need money to buy the thing. You know, that's not a very sophisticated way to put it on purpose, but it's that simple, right?
Yeah. Now, I've got an answer to your question, Mike, that you've scripted me, and it made me laugh because it's got nothing to do with the pod. Your script says, "What do you reckon, Bakos?" And I'm meant to say, "I'd really like to learn Mongolian throat singing."
I was listening to that yesterday, and
What
I
is he
thought,
talking about? I had to Google that, and
oh
now I
yeah,
get it.
did you get any
Yeah,
YouTube stuff?
yeah, I did see YouTube stuff. I was like, oh yeah, I know that type of singing. Mongolian Tuvan throat singing, the main
Yep.
technique of which is known as kumi or kumai. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. It's
No
a
idea.
style of singing practiced by people in Tuva and Mongolia.
Did you have a go?
No,
That we'll
no,
save that
I'd
for
be
our
better at
karaoke
yodeling than that.
nights.
It's hard.
The home of the great Khan dynasty and the Genghis Khan dynasty. I can recommend a great book series called the Conqueror series by Connor Gilden on the
Right.
4-book series on the history of the Mongolians and the Khan dynasty. Very good read.
He'd love a
Oh,
bit of throat singing.
Would
Sometimes I
have
put
loved it.
things on in the office when people arrive just to freak them out, like whether
bet
it's
you do.
thrash metal or, you know, like oud instrumentals. And I did a bit of Mongolian throat singing yesterday. And it just means
Crazy.
people don't visit me as much, which is good because I get to put my head into data.
You would have been that school monitor that's allowed to like ring the electric bell and play the music before class starts, and you would have brought in some random heavy metal tapes or something. I just reckon that's what you did.
Yeah, I brown nosed myself into a position of authority, and then I set fire to everything.
Damaged it.
I think that's kind of my influence on the profit trio as well.
Moving right along.
Move along.
To quote Simon's article, his 6 innovations are, in no particular order: firstly, 45-year loan terms; second, phasing out stamp duty; 3, balloon payments; 4, separating real risk from robotic risk; 5, social housing accountability; and 6, superannuation, LMIU, and family equity. So let's start with 45-year loans. Dave, as a resident mortgage expert, we know in history that max loan terms has been as low as 3, 8 and 10 years. It stands to reason that the longer the loan term, the more a borrower can afford. What's your view on the extension idea?
Yeah, look, it's there's definitely some merit in it. 45-year loan term certainly can increase borrowing capacity and reduce repayments to make it easier to enter the marketplace. So, solving that problem, the 40-year loan terms actually have been around for probably at least 15 years. So there are 40-year loan terms available already. And they started coming out just prior to the GFC. I'm pretty sure they're one of the many imports from the overly flexible US lending market prior to the GFC, and we all know what happened there. So what that meant was these kinds of loans, that this sort of loan maybe had a fit for purpose and could have continued on, probably suffered from a poor time of entering the Australian market just before the GFC hit. And certainly following the GFC, the lending policy pendulum shifted markedly to become much more conservative. And this meant many of the riskier style of loans, like, say, for instance, the 40-year loan term, was kiboshed and probably put on the back burner a lot by many of the lenders. Whereas if it had come out of it at another time, maybe it would have become more popular.
Yeah.
I've also read about and seen firsthand there's a stigma with that, with people don't want to take out a longer loan term because they see it as sort of like an admitting that they're going to take longer to pay off their home loan.
But how is that
And
any different from a 55-year-old going for a mortgage?
well,
All you have
look,
to do is have an exit strategy and the banks will do it.
yeah. So this is a mindset of borrowers. So
Yeah.
people, it's not about lending policy or being 55 and going shivers. I'm not going to pay off my home loan till I'm 85. It just is, you know, if we think of, and probably the people we're talking about mostly trying to help here is younger people get into the property market, or people who it's less affordable, they're probably less likely to be 55-year-olds. And there is a real, there's a stigma to, people have aspirations. Everyone wants to pay off their home loan faster. And so a lot of people just don't consider it.
I think it's a shame, because I could imagine if you were able to take on a 45-year loan term with the absolute intention to smash it earlier than that, but knowing that your salary starts small and gets big as you get older. I don't know why a lender, for example, wouldn't go and devise a product that amortizes the loan sequence in stages so that the end result is that it's finished up in, 30 years. I think that could work.
There is some lending propeller head somewhere that can work out the net present values to, I'm sure they'll figure it out where they make money. But I think one of the big powers in this is that inflation and, wage growth hopefully dissipates the impact or the impetus of that loan balance, right? Because, 45 years down the track, you're paying off what it cost to buy your house whenever you bought it. And just by the passage of time, your LVR is going to drop. I want to, if you don't mind me butting in, I want to challenge your notions, Dave.
What notion's that?
Well, I should mention that, shouldn't I?
There's only one notion I've made that why they'll take a while to take off is because people have a psychology against taking out loans for longer than what is supposedly the norm.
Yeah, I think people will be horrified by the idea of dying with debt, but I think it's a mindset that needs to shift, in all honesty. But what I was going to say is that you talked about this perhaps being an import of American policy, and we all know what happened there. I think the subprime crash was a little bit different, right? Because there were a lot of rogue brokers out there that were signing up loans to people that could clearly not afford them. I think, like, you would know better than me, but we've got a few more stringent requirements here. And, that rampant selling of what were fraudulently probably AAA rated mortgage books is a big part of the problem. And I also think that when you default on a loan in the US, it's different to here in Australia. I think that debt kind of dissolves in a way in America, but it doesn't in Australia. Now,
that's all correct. I wasn't actually saying this loan product was what caused the GFC. What I was saying was possibly, unfortunately, this loan product and many other loan products, some of which should have been kiboshed, got caught up in the post-GFC fallout.
Right.
And so this loan product probably didn't get the carry through beyond the GFC that it should have because of the fallout post the GFC.
Well, I will rescind my challenge, good sir.
Have you?
I was just about to get my pistol out and start pacing, back to back. But I'm like, no, let's just have a beer and calm down.
I'm always happy to pull the pistols out, Mike.
Quick question for you both. Has anyone got stats on the percentage of first home buyers who live in their property for the rest of their life? So first and only home purchases. Have we got any stats on what the percentage is? Because I look at this and think most people would accept that even on a 40-year loan term basis, they're probably going to buy an upgraded property at some stage and reset the loan. And by that stage, they've got equity, they've got income in most cases. They can revert back to the 30.
The old adage used to be that people upgraded every 7 to 10 years or shifted every 7 to 10 years. So like a seat of the pants anecdotal feel is that nobody buys their first home and lives in it forever. Like I'm sure that some people do.
I think it'd be like 5% or less. I would say may tops 10%. So the point is, which is a very well made point, it's a really low percentage of the population. But again, what we're dealing with here is the psychology of the people borrowing the money that needs to change. It's not what we're talking a lot about is the products. I think the product has a place. The product's fine. And lenders can make a profit off a 40-year loan, and lenders do. Some lenders have lent 40-year loan terms. The problem is there isn't a marketplace for it. But we do have proof that people are willing to increase their loan term once it becomes the norm. So I think it would need to be staggered. So the 30-year loan term, you may or may not be aware, was not the normal length loan term, say, for our parents' generation. It used to be 25-year loan terms.
My first loan was 25 years. That was the norm.
Yeah. So the 30-year loan term had a transition period before it became the normal loan term. So I think I do think that this can be a part of the solution, but we might have to do it more incrementally. Like we might have to stagger to 35-year loan terms, get people used to that.
I think
Get
you're
a
right,
sort of
Dave, in the same way that collecting your super has been staggered up over the years. We've accepted that our work life is longer, and that's been an incremental change. I think you're spot on.
Yeah, and the income to asset value keeps nudging its way down the street. So we have to adjust policy to enable us to purchase with the same power as we did 5, 10, 20 years ago. Or, at least keep pace with the disparity.
Yeah, 100%. And look, with the growth in the values of Australian property market, the banking industry has become flexible to make it easier for people to borrow. And that's one of the reasons property prices have kept going up though as well, which is why I think, making it easier to borrow is maybe a continuation of part of what the problem is already, which is property prices being too high for people to get into. Like, we're one of the only few countries in the world that offer offset accounts. Okay, so that creates greater flexibility. It's one of the things that, despite our high debt levels, Australians aren't feeling the pinch as much with interest rates as everyone thought, because we're one of the few countries that we have all this money that reduces our interest in our offsets. Like I don't think they're available in the US and many other sort of major Western nations. We have redraw facilities. When our parents were borrowing, they could only borrow to 80%. We can now borrow to 95, 99 to get into the marketplace. I actually think also with having 70% of loans through mortgage brokers, it's a much more competitive marketplace. So you've got these people searching for lenders who will lend you the money, and there's second tier, third tier lenders. So people do have more flexibility than walking into the bank, with their suit on and polishing their boots. And hopefully, a friend of theirs has put in a good word to the local bank manager for them. We don't have to do that anymore. There's innovation with family equity loan products. And even interest only on home loans was not available once upon a time. So we have had a lot of innovation in the lending space compared to most countries. And this definitely can be another one. But again, I think it probably just pushes up prices further. And I don't know if that's going to end up helping the health of the property market.
That is a very interesting insight that I've just scribbled down, which I think might come up again, or at the very least needs to come up for the second part, is that, is there an aspect of the property market that, dare I say, has a bit of a Ponzi aspect to it, and that every single innovation is stimulatory in some regards, and there's just too many people that benefit from, let's say property manager clipping the ticket, rents go up, they get paid more. Sales agent, yes, their rates might go down, but the market's inflated, they get paid more. Stamp duties, if the property's going up in value, then the state's governments that are drunk on stamp duty, they get paid more. But
100%. I think go through all that. That's. I think you're nailing it there, Mike. I think you go through and let's then remove everything where too many people are clipping a ticket and it pushes up prices. And then you've got to look at the reforms, I think, that possibly don't do that. At least as a starting point.
Yes. Yeah, back to your points, Dave. In many countries, I know from chatting to a driver in Bali, I always quiz them about how property works there. 50 or 60%, I think, is their max LVR, and they have very different interest rates as well. Our parents always talked about that magic 20% saving because they had to. That was the the minimum contribution that they could make. And we reference 20% deposits a lot now, even though it's an outdated misnomer, but it's used as a measure to show unaffordability.
Yeah, I saw you comment on LinkedIn about that exact point yesterday or the day before. I think it's crap that people kind of figure out, okay, well, in Sydney, it now takes 10.6 years to save for a deposit, or 7 years in Brisbane. Don't quote me on the figures, but they're always quoting a 20% deposit. How many first home buyers are buying with a 20% deposit? That's not the reality anymore.
No. And so,
and
again,
in most cases, those that do, it's a family pledge offering, really. It's mum and dad's equity that usually creates the ADLVR for them.
Exactly. Or someone with an inheritance, or who's saved for 20 years, but you can get in with that 5%. And again, this is where it's really tricky to see, and that's sort of going to your point as well, Mike, like a lot of this information that will say, okay, well, it's so hard to get into the property market, but there's a vested interest in who's producing that information. And so they'll use the 20% deposit as their example, when really they should be using a 5% deposit, plus stamp duty, etc. So even you can say a 10% deposit. Yeah, 10% is fine.
Yeah, the mere fact that journalists don't get paid a tremendous amount of money, I think like good ones should be able to be paid a lot more because they're important to society. But the fact that they don't get paid very much and they need to live in the city, many of them are under stress trying to fund housing, and that we've definitely seen that permeate through the column inches. But I like the fact that it enables new entrants to participate. And we need to consider, like you said before, someone that's 55 is very different to someone in their 20s, right? Like someone in their 20s now, they'll probably make the retirement age about 150 by the time, they get to retirement age. But, you add a 40-year loan term, they're still in their 60s. Most people are still working. So I think it's really I think it's a really important thing. And to me, it begs the question, paying off a loan. That is kind of our parents' generation's notion, right? I think if the three of us were obsessed with that, it would have set our personal investing trajectories back quite a margin, right? We understand the value of, you always say yourself, Cate, good and bad debt. And there certainly can be good debt that enables you to leverage into assets that compound in value. I think I referenced the last point that I wanted to make before. People that are critical of the things like the first home buyer innovations, I think this is a similar kind of thing. It's increasing the amount of entrants, which just increases the pressure on prices. So I always kind of worry about these first home buyer grants. They run for however many places, or they run for a certain period of time. It's great for the people that qualify for that, but the ones that miss out because their journey is 6 months later on, or they're still saving, the prices are then a little bit higher for them. And that's a real hard one, that many of these policies are stimulatory, and it does beg the question, like, how can we actually help people without making it harder for the people that missed that tranche of help?
Exactly. That again, that's sort of what you were cottoning onto before, Mike. That's the big challenge, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And after having seen all kinds of stupid, inflationary incentives over the years, mostly around grants and boosts and stamp duty hard cutoffs, I actually like the current ones. And I've said that on this show before. The deposit guarantee, I think, is great. Various shared equity schemes. Shared equity is not for everyone, but if what's standing between you and owning a property is not being able to cover the full purchase cost and mortgage of it, well, then having a partner in crime as the Australian government, it's an option. I'm not saying it's a great option for everyone, but we're seeing people take advantage of that and get into housing, which I think is wonderful. I remember, the sliding scale offering for stamp duty waivers when it first came out. If you both remember, we had a hard cap at 600,000. So first home buyers could have zero stamp duty if they could purchase up to 600, and if it went 1 cent over, they got nothing. And so, of course, you'd get to a unit. I remember going to a little townhouse in Kensington back then when you could buy a townhouse for 600. And I just read the room. The body language was every single bidder was a first-time buyer. They were their parents. The quote range was probably something like 550 to 590 or whatever it was. And the auctioneer called for an opening bid, and I reckon I was in with my first bid in a nanosecond. I thought this property was worth bang on 600. That was my opening bid. We bought it.
Yeah,
right.
no one bid
Shoulder
against you.
slumped. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
tough. And they were all heartbroken. But the point was, $550 to $600,000 properties that particular year absolutely flew. And I was watching $560,000 properties getting bid up to 600 because all these people were desperate to make sure they could get their property and not pay the stamp duty.
That's
Yeah.
weird, isn't it? I remember at the time it skewed the price segmentation so much that it looked like Melbourne market was suffering, but it was just there was a massive run on these lower priced properties. So it's like, why is Melbourne crashing? No, it's not crashing. It's just that
crazy.
there's this huge renaissance on the cheapies.
That's right. And what they did that I thought addressed that issue was created the sliding scale. And there's argument out there now that the sliding scale is outdated and needs to be increased because values have moved. And I would agree with that. But to get back to the point, these days in Melbourne, if you spend 601, you're getting the majority of that stamp duty saving. You're paying a peppercorn, and it's not until you reach 750,000 that your stamp duty concession is over, and you're paying the full tote. So that sliding scale does kind of address this issue, but I'm still very mindful that it segments markets and it can create runs in certain price points. And of course, as you've alluded to, Mike, it does make the data look a little bit interesting when you've got one price point getting a lot of purchaser attention. Dave, what are your thoughts on a positive way to increase first home buyer participation?
Yeah, look, what comes straight to mind to me is removing stamp duty. So at least for first time buyers, and have a land tax, and then make it so that everyone who purchases their first home without stamp duty are now in the land tax system. And pay land tax for all future purchases. And that allows us to start to transition off and wean ourselves away, or wean state governments away from the revenue they receive from stamp duty. So once you've entered the land tax system, you're in it forever. There's
Like the
been
MSW incentive.
Yeah. So, there's been much written about the benefits of this. Obviously, it's a political slippery pole because stamp duty is so vital to the coffers of state governments. But we need a government with the courage to do this. The previous New South Wales Liberal government sort of stepped into that space, and Labor, I think, probably didn't want to lose the stamp duty revenue or stick with something that could have become successful that the Liberal government put in place, have wound that back, which is really disappointing, to be honest. But, we know this allows for more people to buy and sell, move around the country for jobs and lifestyle, greater mobility, and will also, very importantly, it'll increase the supply of property, which will help keep prices more affordable. So that's the first one that came to mind. And then the other one, like, I do believe in accessing superannuation funds for first home buyers for a deposit, a limited amount. This isn't my idea. I did read it once, but I just liked it. The idea of offsetting your first home loan with cash from your superannuation, but it doesn't leave your superannuation. So think of it, at the end of the day, every investment is an account number, has an account number. It's just an account. Your superannuation is an account. So be able to have a offset account that is inside of your superannuation, but it's linked to your home loan, and reducing your interest. So instead of your super or part of your super being invested in shares, for example, like most people's are, it's reducing the interest on your home loan. And, today that's around 10%. So if your home loan rate's about 6 to 7%, and because it's tax-free, and let's say your tax rate's about 30% to 47%, or obviously in super, it's not. But, so your return is quite significant. And it just is a strategy that does allow more first home buyers to use their own money to buy their first property. And although it is inflationary initially, and that's something we've been talking about in particular, Mike's raised, which is a concern with any sort of change policies. It is, once that marketplace, like the maximum percentage of the population who are using this model is reached, it will no longer be inflationary. It will be just part of the landscape. So I think that's a real option for first home buyers as well.
Yeah, very much so. Have either of you got any kind of feel for the average first home buyer superannuation balance? We know what the average age is.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's noted in every single loan applicant's application form.
Yeah.
I would say ballpark, most first home buyers superannuation is probably on average, north of 50,000, which is enough for, to go towards a reasonable deposit, even if, for most people are borrowing 95 to 99%. But there are many in six figures, and 100,000, 200,000 as well, some buying with partners. So I think for most, it would provide a meaningful contribution.
Certainly on the offset front, you're absolutely right. And when you think about the return that you're getting on your super that remains protected, the question arises if there's significant property losses, if a loss is crystallised, but that's going down a rabbit hole that we don't have time for. So back to the stamp duty phase out, it's pretty clear to me that the states, in Mike's words, are drunk on stamp duty revenues. The government handling fee, as Simon puts it, accounts for a massive $200 billion in stamp duty charges over the last 10 years, which is staggering.
Yeah, I've said a couple of times, I want to see this stamp. Like, it must be diamond encrusted, gold plated. I'm sure there was a time where a paper came in and it got like one of those little stamps, ones where you flip the thing up and you wet it with the ink and you bang it down, and okay, well, maybe that's worth $125 because someone's got to read it and do it. But, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a pop, like it's absolutely insane. And what I think this really destroys is mobility. And Simon himself says he believes that we don't have a lack of dwellings. We have a mobility crisis where we have, that quintessential little old lady with the 5-bedroom home that's not fit for purpose anymore, that, fears downsizing because of the stamp duty impost. Maybe it's a little bit irrational, a bit like, people not wanting to take out 40-year loans. But there's a pretty strong argument to say that people, housing it's a big deal to move from one to the other, right? We know that the stock market is considered liquid. Yeah, and the housing market is illiquid. Just because, you're physically having to move, you're physically having to put your house on the market. So already there's barriers to that mobility, but stamp duty just seems to be just a kick in the guts to anyone that's wanting to shift. So I really think if we can get people in homes that are more fit for purpose, we will go some way to solving the lack of accommodation for home, for principal place of residence occupiers and for tenants.
Yeah, agreed. A long-touted replacement is an annual land tax for all homeowners, as you've both just said. But Simon even ran some calculations in a recent piece that he wrote about a 3% of income annualised housing levy, which is another way of thinking about it altogether. But the point is we're looking at potential solutions in this episode and canvassing what some people are coming up with as alternatives. So I think it's powerful. Now, let's talk about balloon payments. And the best way to think about this is to think about car loans with residual terms at the end of the agreement. In essence, it means you're paying less per week or month to month. What do you both think about balloons?
Personally, I'm terrified of them. One popped at my birthday party when I was 3, and I've been in therapy ever since.
Oh, that's so cute.
That was a gag that Mike added for me to say.
A little Easter egg.
You're scripting Easter egg.
Very good.
Sorry if that triggered you, Dave. I don't know if that was a true story.
No, I've never had an issue with a balloon, Mike, but I do like how you add in these things, which I personally just think are something to do with your childhood and background, but you project them upon to me, which is fine if that's
Pretty
how you
much.
deal with it.
My way of dealing with them.
Yeah. Look, I guess balloon payments are another option to having a 30-year loan term, but but obviously not paying off the full loan and having that balloon balance, which provides more cash flow to purchase a better house because your repayments are lower across the 30-year loan term. The reason they're acceptable with car loans and other equipment finance is because the loan term is shorter, generally 5 to 7 years. Although, they are depreciating assets versus a home, so the security is not as strong. Personally, I think we want to keep things simple. So I'd probably prefer to increase loan terms, go from 30 to 35 years and then to 40 and 45, just because the simplicity of it, everybody understands that. A lot of people can be a bit more confused about what a balloon payment is. Not everyone is taking out those kinds of loans or have dealt with them. And then I can imagine lenders coming up with policies also that only provide these types of loans for people who are, and this is the other risk with even the longer term loans as well, is potentially, these types of loans are only given to people with good quality credit ratings, available equity and cash flow, and they're actually not made available for the people who really need them. Certainly a balloon type loan is more complex to understand. So I think they're probably an inferior option. But I do think a risk is that if we do sort of create these longer term loans or balloon balances, it might just end up the people with greater wealth and investors and higher value homes who actually make the most of them. And again, that is back to what we were talking about earlier. It then just is more inflationary to the property market. So, the devil's always in the detail with creating lender policy or for any kind of policy for that matter. So, I don't know if you two have any thoughts on how you stop that happening and these more flexible loans only getting in the hands of the people who already have plenty of investment properties and, greater wealth. But, I think that's the risk. A lot of these things can have unintended consequences.
Of course, it's very, very hard to get, a one-size product that fits all that will solve the world's problems. And we've seen, in many ways, new incentives and offerings that have not necessarily helped the cohort they've been designed to, but they've also created, an imbalance with the people that didn't need it.
It could be means tested. It could be, certified first home buyer only. But again, outside of the inflationary considerations, we are generally talking about appreciating assets rather than depreciating assets. But a bit like Cate was saying, with a 40-year loan term, let's say with a balloon as well, what if this is in a poorly purchased property? So I think we've got to find a way to protect the consumer, right? Like we might have to say, all right, well, this is only available with the assistance of a suitably qualified property buyer's agent or investment advisor, or let's say a strategic mortgage broker, as you always like to say, Dave.
Or a property planner.
Yeah, or a property planner. And, bung a quantity surveyor in there just to make sure everything's built and up to snuff. Look, I think you've got to, it's a little bit more nuanced and it'll be a little bit more difficult to get it right. I think the idea has merit. I think it's not as easy as a 40-year loan term. And we do need to make sure that people are protected, because it can sort of stack the deck against you if you're purchasing a property that is not investment grade.
Yeah.
Agreed. But already there, we're really highlighting some of the challenges, aren't we, and the risks if the policy isn't set up correctly. And, can we even legislate for lenders as to how they lend their money?
The next point was about real versus robotic risk. So what we're talking about here mostly applies to investors. Simon suggested a P&I setup for your principal place of residence, but for investors, an evergreen P&I term, as well as a lower serviceability buffer. Say, take the current rate from 3% down to 2%. And as your portfolio expands, as low as a 1.5% buffer where the LVR is 65% or better. And he's picked some specific numbers, but we get the gist of it. Mike, what are your thoughts here? Right.
Yeah, look, I think it begs the question, how often do we enact legislation and then look at it to see how effective it is down the track? You know, Kerry Packer in his famous speech about, you know, minimizing his tax said, you know, every time you guys come up with a new law, you should have to repeal another one. So you think about some of the APRA intervention when property investors were going gangbusters, that's still in place. And the RBA has actually stated that there is less risk for investment property purchases than there are owner occupiers. I didn't see that at the time where I was putting my notes together, but I've seen that. So there is evidence to say that there's less borrowing risk to investors. So why are they paying a higher interest rate? I mean, right now we're in a crisis of rental accommodation. Your private investors are supplying 91% of private rental accommodation, and it's not enough. So this is just something that's making it harder for them. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, this mortgage innovation conversation. Dave, what's your take?
Look, I think it goes back to the question, if a healthy property market is one that allows more people to participate in the property market, and that's probably, again, I think that's the biggest problem at the moment. I don't really see how this helps other than those who already own multiple properties. It just supports investors buying more property, which then does provide for more rental property. But I think this will come at the expense of new entrants unless we also ramp up supply, so that there is a property for everyone in the country. And currently we're about 640,000 short, and we're building less than 200,000 homes in a year. It was 170,000 last year. So in other words, we would need to have no population growth for 3 or 4 years to get up to speed to match houses to the people who need them. So, you know, this is a good idea if we want a higher percentage of renters in the country. If we want that to go, you know, not be 33% and maybe become 35 and 37 and 39, less people, you know, owning their own home. That's what will happen with that policy, I believe. And this is the thing that, again, there's always unintended consequences, which is why, in essence, no solution should be considered in isolation. Many solutions sound great in isolation. You can hear someone talking about a solution and you're not thinking of all the other things that it's going to impact. And you go, oh, that's a great idea. But you've actually got to understand how they impact other solutions simultaneously. And that's, again, why this is so complex. So that's my view. Yeah.
In part, Dave, I think something that we can never get away from, and I won't get the popular vote here, is how many renters do we have who are choosing to rent? They're not pushed into renting because they can't afford or because home ownership's been stolen from them. They're choosing to rent. It might be that they're not wanting to buy. They've got investments in other asset classes. They're not interested in having any money in property. They might be transient. They might be young people that are just wanting to move out of home for the first time. There's any number of reasons why people choose to rent. And I'm certain that wherever we're sitting at, I think it's 33-point-something% at the moment, there's a large majority of them that are aspirational homeowners one day. They would love to get out of renting. But in that percentage, there's got to be a cohort, and a large one at that are choosing to rent. We've always had a proportion of renters hovering around that 1/3 mark historically. It's been a figure that hasn't had a lot of elasticity in our country.
Yeah,
So
it's gradually gone up a little bit in the last sort of 10 years or so, crept up a couple percentage points, and people are worried it'll keep creeping up. But ultimately, look, and this is why it's so complex, because these things are belief systems. Like, if someone believes in policy or power, or this party believes that it should be at 33%, they're going to be looking at policies that go, okay, well, if the number of renters goes up by above 33%, that policy is bad. There's going to be other people who might say more and more people are choosing to rent and buy investment properties. and this policy is good, and we don't mind if the number of renters gets up to 40%. So it's actually our belief systems that then will determine our perspective on a lot of these types of ideas, and that's why we have so much disagreement.
Yeah.
It's a finely balanced ecosystem, isn't it? I don't think necessarily incentivizing investors has to push first home buyers out of the way, but you look at the situation we're in at the moment, and we talked about the deposit hurdle. If you are renting now at, fairly inflated prices, maybe that's not the best word, but it's very, very competitive. You're not in a great environment to save a deposit to enter the market. So I do think the balance hasn't been achieved right now, and it does need to, we do need greater participation from investors. We can see that they have dropped, and we can see that they've sold, and it's actually not a good environment for prospective or aspiring first home buyers with the rental crisis we have right now.
Even just on the rental side of things, I mean, they're just examples of unintended consequences at the higher end of trying to rent in terms of, say, more sort of affluent areas. State governments have put increased land taxes, which really get expensive as you own more land value. And someone might have had an investment property with sort of high land value, and now that land tax is almost chewing up all of the rent they're receiving. And so you're seeing less rentals be available in inner suburbs, I believe, because of the land tax. And I think that's an example where it's going to be so hard to get a rental property in sort of more, I guess, affluent areas. And so that's just another example, I think, of how there's unintended consequences when, governments change the rules around this or that. And that's why it's such a tricky one to solve.
Thanks for that, Dave. I totally agree. Now, we've had such a great time with this app, and we still have 2 more segments to go. We were going to touch on housing accountability and also superannuation and LMI, but rather than smash our listeners with a 1-hour episode, we're going to save it for part 2. And thank Mike very much for prepping the show notes. We'll go into our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
This is a courageous episode because lots of people will have lots of different ideas about this. And as we've just seen here between the 3 of us, we've been able to politely disagree on some points and pick out the issues, which I think is very valuable. But what is important is that people who care about housing and are in this industry and have experience, expertise, or even just a really strong view on something can be in a safe space to speak up. When I met the Shadow Housing Minister at our people breakfast, Mike, he was very engaging and very willing to talk. And what was really exciting is I gave him my business card and said, I do want to hear from you. I want you to reach out. I want to make sure that we can contribute. I don't necessarily want to have the strongest say, but I want to make you aware of the things that at the coalface haven't worked and the ideas that we think are worth canvassing. So I think it's really important to keep the conversation going. And as political as it sounds, not to get so political that we don't shoot people down for having a voice and having some ideas.
Yeah, look, I think for my gold nugget, which hopefully leads into the next episode, is that we require a national debate on this. And I think the politicians have had their opportunity and they've biffed it. Like the state politicians' policies are full of unintended consequences. They're full of, press releases and fancy ideas that are supposed to solve problems, but they're exacerbating it. And the mere fact that we've got political parties holding each other to ransom for real reforms and until they get their way on housing policy, yet they don't seem to understand housing. I think we, the people, this is going to sound real Che Guevara, but I think we've got to pull back that debate and say, here's what we think is reasonable, because none of the politicians are brave enough to, for example, recognise that investors have a part to play. Now, at 91% of private rental accommodation, get on board. Investors are part of this solution. So I want to encourage people to jump into this debate and send their thoughts and even critiquing some of our ideas or Simon's ideas. So please participate. We'd love to share your thoughts.
Yeah, look, that's a great gold nugget, Mike. I'll just concur with that. Send us your thoughts on what you think will make a difference to creating a healthy property market for all participants in Australia. I think this episode has just highlighted how complex it is, and how many different sort of vested interests and perspectives there can be, and how many of the sort of proposed solutions can actually be inflationary and continue to push property prices up. So it's a vexed discussion, but it's one worth having. So I look forward to continuing it with you both next week.
I'll see you guys then.
Cheers.
See you
I'll be
later.
here.